I have to start by giving you two secrets. Secret number one is, despite what you might have heard, I'm actually a pretty big fan of democracy. In fact, I think I'm its best fan because I like it exactly as much as it should be liked. All right. In the same way, I'm a fan of Metallica, but they have a lot of flaws. And they could be improved, perhaps. We can at least imagine improvements, and there's a question of whether we can get them to improve in practice. Secondly, the other secret is, even though we pose this question, do you need more or less democracy? It's not really a good question. Who's the we? What do we make democratic? Is we China? Then yeah, we obviously need more democracy. Is we California? I don't know. All right, that's part of the problem. Who's the we here? Where do we want more democracy? So suppose I try to argue that we should have maximum market power, and I made the following argument to you. I said, look, in the 20th century, we had this massive experimentation. 90 countries tried communist socialism, and it failed every single time. It was a disaster. And 90 countries tried some degree of market capitalism, and it went 90 for 90. Therefore, the proof of this is we should have extensive unregulated market economies everywhere, just pure laissez-faire capitalism everywhere. You wouldn't think that's a very good argument. You'd say, oh, okay, hold on. That's a good case for having some sort of basic market type economy, but it's not necessarily a good case for having a complete unregulated market economy. After all, market economies have certain systematic flaws. What are they? Well, I'm going to point out what some of them are, and then I'll point out these also apply to democracy as well. So a similar kind of argument applies to democracy. So for instance, what's part of the problem with markets? You might say, well, they underprovide public goods. There isn't a strong incentive to provide bridges and streets and military protection at the right level because people want to free ride. After all, if other people are providing the good, I don't need to provide it myself, and so what governments do is force people to provide them. Well, what about good governance in the first place? Governance itself is a public good. That's not controversial. It's the classic case of a public good. And in fact, people might be incentivized to underprovide it. After all, if I stop voting tomorrow, it won't make any difference to the quality of life of anyone in Fairfax County, Virginia, or the East Coast, or the United States, or really anywhere. And so I have an incentive to free ride in the same way as others, and that might change my behavior in deleterious ways. What are other problems with markets, for instance? What if there's not enough competition between firms? When there isn't enough competition between firms can exert too much power, they can manipulate prices, they can give a bad deal to the consumer, and so governments around the world try to make sure that there's more rather than less competition. Competition creates quality. Well, government has the same problem. Elections every 4 years. I mean, imagine if you were deciding between eating at Chipotle and McDonald's at a 4-year block. Wouldn't work very well. Governments are inherently monopolistic. I can't just choose to go live in another country, and I have more freedom to do that than most people in the world do. I'm stuck with the country that I'm in to a certain degree. We also have oftentimes limited competition in the sense of, like, say, in the United States, we only have 2 political parties that ever have any chance of really winning power, and there's a question of how different they really are. But we have a lack of competition, and that can reduce the quality of government, just as it can reduce the quality of product provided on a market. We also have a problem on markets of asymmetric information. Suppose I'm an auto mechanic and you have a problem with your BMW and you come and ask me what the problem is. You don't know much about cars, I do. I could lie to you and give you a product you don't really need, provide services that you don't really need, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to check that. And this is often an argument in favor of more rather than less regulation in the market. But it applies to governments as well. The people who are in power know significantly more than the people who are not in power. In fact, the people who are not in power, generally speaking, know very little. It's not true everywhere to the same degree, but one of the most persistent findings in political science since people first started studying this is that most people know pretty much nothing. Right? And it's weird because we all contain with us all the time access to all the world's information almost instantly, and yet when we measure political information around the world, what we generally find is back in 1950, people knew nothing, and then now, in 2023, they also know nothing. And sometimes they actually know less than nothing. So for instance, there's a thing called the American National Election Studies, which is conducted every 2 years in the United States, and they ask voters just a very simple battery of basic questions, and about the bottom 25% of voters do worse than chance on these questions. Like literally a coin flip or rolling dice would do better than these voters do, and they vote accordingly. Brexit might be an example, as we should talk about later. There's problems of rationality. So one of the complaints in the market is, what if people don't think long term? What if they're biased in certain ways? Isn't this an argument in favor of paternalistic regulation, preventing people from drinking too much sugar or smoking cigarettes and doing other sorts of things? But when we look at people as voters, we find these same persistent rationality failures where they process information in a very poor and often very biased way. In fact, to put two models of democracy down, one basic theory says people know what they care about, they learn how the world works, they find the party that best matches their view of what would work, and they vote for that party. We all do that, and then the result is a democratic forum that gives the people what's good for them. But what if instead what's mostly going on, which I think is true of the US, I'm not going to say it's true here, but it's true of the US, is people's votes don't really matter, the effect of my vote doesn't make a difference, except for one thing, whether you like me. So I want to fit in with you, you're part of my peer group, I find out how you vote, and I vote for the same party every time, and you give me social rewards. And I don't even care or pay attention to what they do. Or worse, I'll rationalize whatever it is they happen to be doing. So if this is an argument for regulation of markets, it's also an argument for regulation of democratic voting. What about externalities? Politics is all externalities all the time. Right? When we vote, it's not like when I vote, I get my favorite form of government and you get your favorite form of government. We get the government the people voted for. We're constantly imposing the cost of our decisions upon other people. This is an argument for regulation inside the market. It's why the government, say, controls how much I'm allowed to pollute, what kind of gas mileage my car can get. What about regulating voters for the same reason? Finally, we have problems of principal agents, where the people who are running the government could run things for their own benefit at the expense of the people that they're running it for. This happens in organizations, but it happens in every realistic democracy as well. It's easy to look at the United States, for instance, and say that Washington, D.C. is doing a really good job making life in Washington, D.C. work for those people who live there. What about the rest of the country? It's not as obvious. So basically, we have this kind of problem. If we concentrate power in the hands of the very, very few, what we get is they use that power in a rational way for their self-interest. Putin is very good at running Russia for himself. When we spread power out among the many, what we tend to get are people who care about their country, but don't bother think very carefully about it. For the same reason that, just imagine as an analogy, I had a class with 10,000 students, and I said, at the end of the semester, I'm giving you a final exam worth 100% of your grade, but rather than you getting your grade and you getting your score and you getting your score, I'm going to average all scores together and everyone will get exactly the same score. What would the grade be? It would be a failing grade. We know that experimentally, by the way. It would be a failing grade, not because people are stupid, not because they're corrupt, but because it has perverse incentives. Democracy, as we find it, and Hélène actually agrees with this point, has this perverse incentive. So what we're asking is, how do we fix it? Well, I have a million different theories about what we should do here, but since I want to say something provocative, I'll tell you my most provocative idea. Let's have what's called enlightened preference voting. The way it works is like this. On election day, everyone gets to vote. No one gets excluded. Even children can vote. You're in favor of excluding children because you're epistocrats. I'm going to make you more democratic. Let's let the children vote. When they vote, though, they do three things. First, they tell us who they are. We get demographic information about them. Second, they tell us what they want. Whatever it is we're voting on, they tell us their answer to it. And third, we give them a battery of questions, very basic questions about politics. Who's the vice president? Who's the prime minister? Who's your member of parliament? What's the tax rate? Whatever these questions might be, there's a good question of what they should be. But we give them, a battery of 30 questions. By the way, when you give this to Americans or British people, I don't know about the Swiss in particular, they do very badly on this. When we have these three sets of data, who people are, what they want, and what they know, you can statistically simulate what the people would have wanted had they been fully informed, but were otherwise demographically identical. Right? Why not try that as a system of government? It's the thing that political scientists have been using for a long time to try to figure out how things like information or demographics affects people's voting behavior. Why not use this to actually choose government itself? We can't make the people smarter, but we can simulate a smart public using the public that we have. Let's try that. So thanks very much.
Thank you.